Then Edgethow's brave son spoke. Remember, Hrothgar, O knowing king, now when my danger is near, the warm words we uttered, and if your enemy should end my life, then be, O generous prince, forever the father and protector of all whom I leave behind me here in your hands, my beloved comrades left with no leader, their leader dead. And the precious gifts you gave me, my friend, send them to Hygelac. May he see in their golden brightness, the Geats' great lord gazing at your treasure, that here in Denmark I found a noble protector, a giver of rings whose rewards I won and briefly relished. And you, Unferth, let my famous old sword stay in your hands. I shall shape glory with Hrunting, or death will hurry me from this earth. As his words ended, he leapt into the lake, would not wait for anyone's answer. The heaving water covered him over. For hours he sank through the waves. At last he saw the mud of the bottom. And all at once the greedy she-wolf who'd ruled those waters for 100 years discovered him, saw that a creature from above had come to explore the bottom of her wet world. She welcomed him in her claws, clutched at him savagely but could not harm him, tried to work her fingers through the tight ring-woven mail on his breast, but tore and scratched in vain. Then she carried him, armor and sword and all, to her home. He struggled to free his weapon and failed. The fight brought other monsters, swimming to see her catch, a host of sea beasts who beat at his mail shirt, stabbing with tusks and teeth as they followed along. Then he realized suddenly that she'd brought him into someone's battle hall, and there the water's heat could not hurt him, nor anything in the lake attack him through the building's high arching roof. A brilliant light burned all around him, the lake itself like a fiery flame. Then he saw the mighty water witch, and swung his sword, his ring-marked blade, straight at her head. The iron sang its fierce song, sang Beowulf's strength. But her guest discovered that no sword could slice her evil skin, that Hrunting could not hurt her, was useless now when he needed it. They wrestled. She ripped and tore and clawed at him, bit holes in his helmet, and that too failed him. For the first time in years of being worn to war, it would earn no glory. It was the last time anyone would wear it. But Beowulf longed only for fame, leapt back into battle. He tossed his sword aside, angry. The steel-edged blade lay where he'd dropped it. If weapons were useless, he'd use his hands, the strength in his fingers. So fame comes to the men who mean to win it and care about nothing else. He raised his arms and seized her by the shoulder. Anger doubled his strength. He threw her to the floor. She fell, Grendel's fierce mother, and the Geats' proud prince was ready to leap on her, but she rose at once and repaid him with her clutching claws, wildly tearing at him. He was weary, that best and strongest of soldiers. His feet stumbled, and in an instant she had him down, held helpless. Squatting with her weight on his stomach, she drew a dagger, brown with dried blood, and prepared to avenge her only son. But he was stretched on his back, and her stabbing blade was blunted by the woven mail shirt he wore on his chest. The hammered links held. The point could not touch him. He'd have traveled to the bottom of the earth, Edgethow's son, and died there if that shining woven metal had not helped. And holy God, who sent him victory, gave judgment for truth and right, ruler of the heavens. Once Beowulf was back on his feet and fighting. Then he saw hanging on the wall a heavy sword hammered by giants, strong and blessed with their magic, the best of all weapons, but so massive that no ordinary man could lift its carved and decorated length. He drew it from its scabbard, broke the chain on its hilt, and then, savage now, angry and desperate, lifted it high over his head and struck with all the strength he had left, caught her in the neck, and cut it through, broke bones and all. Her body fell to the floor, lifeless. The sword was wet with her blood, and Beowulf rejoiced at the sight. The brilliant light shone suddenly as though burning in that hall, and as bright as heaven's own candle lit in the sky. He looked at her home, then following along the wall, went walking, his hands tight on the sword, his heart still angry. He was hunting another dead monster, and took his weapon with him for final revenge against Grendel's vicious attacks, his nighttime raids, over and over, coming to Heorot when Hrothgar's men slept, killing them in their beds, eating some on the spot, 15 or more, and running to his loathsome moor with another such sickening meal waiting in his pouch. But Beowulf repaid him for those visits, found him lying dead in his corner, armless, exactly as that fierce fighter had sent him out from Heorot, then struck off his head with a single swift blow. The body jerked for the last time, then lay still. The wise old warriors who surrounded Hrothgar, like him staring into the monster's lake, saw the waves surging and blood spurting through. They spoke about Beowulf, all the greybeards, whispered together and said that hope was gone, that the hero had lost fame and his life at once, and would never return to the living, come back as triumphant as he had left. Almost all agreed that Grendel's mighty mother, the she-wolf, had killed him. The sun slid over past noon, went further down. The Danes gave up, left the lake, and went home, Hrothgar with them. The Geats stayed, sat sadly, watching, imagining they saw their lord, but not believing they would ever see him again. Then the sword melted, blood-soaked, dripping down like water, disappearing like ice when the world's eternal Lord loosens invisible fetters and unwinds icicles and frost as only he can, he who rules time and seasons, he who is truly God. The monster's hall was full of rich treasures, but all that Beowulf took was Grendel's head and the hilt of the giant's jeweled sword. The rest of that ring-marked blade had dissolved in Grendel's steaming blood, boiling even after his death. And then the battle's only survivor swam up and away from those silent corpses. The water was calm and clean, the whole huge lake peaceful once the demons who'd lived in it were dead. Then that noble protector of all seamen swam to land, rejoicing in the heavy burdens he was bringing with him. He and all his glorious band of Geats thanked God that their leader had come back unharmed. They left the lake together. The Geats carried Beowulf's helmet and his mail shirt. Behind them, the water slowly thickened as the monster's blood came seeping up. They walked quickly, happily, across roads all of them remembered, left the lake and the cliffs alongside it, brave men staggering under the weight of Grendel's skull, too heavy for fewer than 4 of them to handle, 2 on each side of the spear jammed through it, yet proud of their ugly load and determined that the Danes seated in Heorot should see it. Soon 14 Geats arrived at the hall, bold and warlike, and with Beowulf their lord and leader they walked on the mead hall green. Then the Geats' brave prince entered Heorot, covered with glory for the daring battles he had fought. He sought Hrothgar to salute him and show Grendel's head. He carried that terrible trophy by the hair, brought it straight to where the Danes sat, drinking, the queen among them. It was a weird and wonderful sight, and the warriors.
Beowulf spoke. Hrothgar, behold, great Healfdene's son, this glorious sign of victory brought you by joyful Geats. My life was almost lost, fighting for it, struggling under water. I'd have been dead at once, and the fight finished, the she-devil victorious, if our Father in heaven had not helped me. Hrunting, Unferth's noble weapon, could do nothing, nor could I until the ruler of the world showed me, hanging shining and beautiful on a wall, a mighty old sword. So God gives guidance to those who can find it from no one else. I used the weapon he had offered me, drew it, and, when I could, swung it, killed the monstrous hag in her own home. Then the ring-marked blade burned away, as that boiling blood spilled out. I carried off all that was left, this hilt. I've avenged their crimes, and the Danes they've killed. And I promise you that whoever sleeps in Heorot, you, your brave soldiers, anyone of all the people in Denmark, old or young, they and you may now sleep without fear of either monster, mother or son. Then he gave the golden sword hilt to Hrothgar, who held it in his wrinkled hands and stared at what giants had made and monsters owned. It was his, an ancient weapon shaped by wonderful smiths. Now that Grendel and his evil mother had been driven from the earth, God's enemies scattered and dead. That best of swords belonged to the best of Denmark's rulers, the wisest ring-giver Danish warriors have ever known. The old king bent close to the handle of the ancient relic and saw written there the story of ancient wars between good and evil, the opening of the waters, the flood sweeping giants away, how they suffered and died, that race who hated the ruler of us all and received judgment from his hands, surging waves that found them wherever they fled. And Hrothgar saw runic letters clearly carved in that shining hilt, spelling its original owner's name, he for whom it was made, with its twisted handle and snake-like carvings. Then he spoke, Healfdene's son, and everyone was silent. What I say, speaking from a full memory and after a life spent in seeking what was right for my people, is this. This prince of the Geats, Beowulf, was born a better man. Your fame is everywhere, my friend, reaches to the ends of the earth, and you hold it in your heart wisely, patient with your strength and our weakness. What I said I will do, in the name of the friendship we've sworn. Your strength must solace your people now, and mine no longer. Be not, as Hermit once was to my people, too proud to care what their hearts hid, bringing them only destruction and slaughter. In his mad rages he killed them himself, comrades and followers who ate at his table. At the end he was alone, knew none of the joys of life with other men. A famous ruler granted greater strength than anyone alive in his day, but dark and bloodthirsty in spirit. He shared out no treasure, showed his soldiers no road to riches and fame. And then that affliction on his people's face suffered horribly for his sins. Be taught by this lesson. Learn what a king must be. I tell you his tale, old as I am, only for you. Our eternal Lord grants some men wisdom, some wealth, makes others great. The world is God's. He allows a man to grow famous and his family rich, gives him land and towns to rule and delight in, lets his kingdom reach as far as the world runs. And who, in human unwisdom, in the middle of such power, remembers that it all will end, and too soon. Prosperity, prosperity, prosperity. Nothing troubles him, no sickness, not passing time, no sorrows, no sudden war breaking out of nowhere, but all the world turns when he spins it. How can he know when he sins? And then pride grows in his heart, planted quietly but flourishing. And while the keeper of his soul sleeps on, while conscience rests and the world turns faster, a murderer creeps closer, comes carrying a tight-strung bow with terrible arrows, and those sharp points strike home, are shot in his breast, under his helmet. He's helpless. And so the devil's dark urgings wound him, for he can't remember how he clung to the rotting wealth of this world, how he clawed to keep it, how he earned no honor, no glory in giving golden rings, how he forgot the future glory God gave him at his birth, and forgetting, did not care. And finally his body fails him. These bones and flesh, quickened by God, fall and die. And some other soul inherits his place in heaven, some open-handed giver of old treasures, who takes no delight in mere gold, Guard against such wickedness, beloved Beowulf, best of warriors, and choose instead eternal happiness. Push away pride. Your strength, your power are yours for how many years? Soon you'll return them where they came from. Sickness or a sword's edge will end them, or a grasping fire, or the flight of a spear, or surging waves, or a knife's bite, or the terror of old age, or your eyes darkening over. It will come. Death comes faster than you think. No one can flee it. So I have led the Danes for 50 years, protected them from all peoples on this earth, my sword and my spear so ready that no one anywhere under God's high sun was eager to wage war here in Denmark. And here too the change has come. And we wept for our dead when Grendel invaded Heorot. My enemy raided this hall. My sorrow, my grief was as great and lasting as it was helpless. Then thanks be given to God, eternal Lord of us all. You came, and that endless misery was over, and I lived, now to behold this bloody head. Go in, feast, be as happy as your fame deserves. When morning shines, we shall each have owned more of my treasures. Beowulf obeyed him, entered Heorot cheerfully, and took his place at the table. And once again Danes and Geats feasted together, a host of famous warriors in a single hall. Then the web of darkness fell, and it was night. They rose. Hrothgar, the gray-haired old Dane, was heavy with sleep, and Beowulf was glad that a bed was waiting, the bravest of warriors exhausted with the work he'd done. A Danish servant showed him the road to that far-off, quiet country where sleep would come and take him and his followers. Hrothgar's visitors were well cared for. Whatever they needed was theirs. Then Beowulf rested. Heorot rose high above him, gleaming in the darkness. The Geats slept till a black-feathered raven sang his cheerful song, and the shining sun burned away shadows. And those seafarers hurried from their beds, anxious to begin the voyage home, ready to start, their hearts already sailing on a ship's swift back. Then Unferth came, with Hrunting, his famous sword, and offered it to Beowulf, asked him to accept a precious gift. The prince took it, thanked him, and declared the weapon one he was proud to own. His words blamed it for nothing, were spoken like the hero he was. The war gear was ready, the Geats were armored and eager to be gone. Quickly Beowulf sought Hrothgar's throne, where the king sat waiting for his famous visitor's farewell. Beowulf spoke. We crossed the sea to come here. It is time to return, to go back to our beloved lord Hygelac. Denmark was a gracious host. You welcomed us warmly. Anything I can do here on this earth to earn your love, O great king, anything more than I have done, battles I can fight in your honor, summon me. I will come as I came once before. If I hear from across the ocean that your neighbors have threatened you with war, or oppressed you as enemies once oppressed you, here I will bring 1,000 warriors, 1,000 armed Geats to protect your throne. I trust Hygelac. Our king is young, but if I need his help, to better help you, to lend you our strength, our battle-sharp spears, to shield you and honor you as you deserve, I know his words and his deeds will support me. And someday, if your oldest son Hrethric comes visiting our court, he will find a host of good friends among the Geats. No one who goes visiting far-off lands is more welcome than a strong and noble warrior. Hrothgar replied, All-knowing God must have sent you such words. Nothing so wise from a warrior so young has ever reached these ancient ears. Your hands are strong, your heart and your lips are knowing. If your lord, Hrethel's son, is slain by a spear, or falls sick and dies, or is killed by a sword, and you have survived whatever battle sweeps him off, I say that the Geats could do no better, find no man better suited to be king, keeper of warriors and their treasure, than you. If you take the throne they will surely offer you. Beloved Beowulf, you please me more the longer I can keep you here in Denmark. You've turned Danes and Geats into brothers, brought peace where once there was war, and sealed friendship with affection. This will last as long as I live and am king here. We will share our treasures, greeting travelers from across the sea with outstretched hands. Ring-proud ships will carry our gifts and the tokens of our love. Your people live by the old ways. Their hearts, like ours, are forever open to their friends, but firmly closed against their enemies. Then he gave the Geats prince a dozen new gifts, prayed for his safety, commanded him to seek his people, yet not to delay too long in visiting Hrothgar once more. The old king kissed him, held that best of all warriors by the shoulder, and wept, unable to hold back his tears. Gray and wise, he knew how slim were his chances of ever greeting Beowulf again. But seeing his face, he was forced to hope. His love was too warm to be hidden. His tears came running too quickly to be checked. His very blood burned with longing, and then Beowulf left him, left Heorot, walked across the green in his golden armor, exulting in the treasures heaped high in his arms. His ship was at anchor, he had it ready to sail, and so Hrothgar's rich treasures would leave him, travel far from that perfect king without fault or blame, until winter had followed winter, and age had stolen his strength, spirited it off as it steals from many men. Then the band of Geats, young and brave, marching in their ring-locked armor, reached the shore. The coast guard saw them coming and about to go, as he'd seen them before. He hurried down the hillside, whipping his horse, but this time shouted no challenge, told them only how the Geats would be watching too, and would welcome such warriors in shining mail. Their broad-beamed ship lay bobbing at the edge of the sand. They loaded it high with armor and horses, and all the rich treasure it could hold. The mast stood high and straight over heaped-up wealth, Hrothgar's, and now theirs. Beowulf rewarded the boat's watchman, who had stayed behind, with a sword that had hammered gold wound on its handle. The weapon brought him honor. Then the ship left shore, left Denmark, traveled through deep water. Deck timbers creaked, and the wind billowing through the sails stretched from the mast, tied tight with ropes, did not hold them back, did not keep the ring-proud ship from foaming swiftly through the waves, the sea currents, across the wide ocean until they could see familiar headlands, cliffs that sprang out of Geatish soil. Driven by the wind, the ship rammed high on the shore. Harbor guards came running to meet them, men who for days had waited and watched for their beloved comrades to come crossing the waves. They anchored the high-bowed ship, moored it close to the shore where the booming sea could not pull it loose and lead it away. Then they carried up the golden armor, the ancient swords, the jewels, brought them to Higlac's home, their ring-giver's hall near the sea, where he lived surrounded by his followers. He was a famous king, with a fitting high hall and a wife, Hygd, young but wise and knowing beyond her years. She was Hareth's daughter, a noble queen with none of the niggardly ways of women like Thrith. Hygd gave the Geats gifts with open hands, but Thrith was too proud, an imperious princess with a vicious tongue, and so fierce and wild that her father's followers averted their eyes as she passed, knowing that if anyone but their king watched where she walked, her hands would shape a noose to fit their necks. She would lie. Her father's lieutenants would write out her warrants, and he who had stared would end his life on the edge of an ancient sword. And how great a sin for a woman, whether fair or black, to create fear and destruction, for a woman who should walk in the ways of peace, to kill with pretended insults. But Hemming's kinsmen tamed her. His hall guests told a different story, spread the news that Thrith had forgotten her gory tricks, once her wise father had sent her to a wedding with Offa, married her to that brave young soldier, sent her across the yellow-green sea to that gold-adorned champion, a fierce fighter in war or peace. They praised her now for her generous heart and her goodness and the high and most noble paths she walked, filled with adoring love for that leader of warriors, her husband. He was a man as brave and strong and good, it is said, as anyone on this earth, a spear-bold soldier who knew no fear, exalted with gifts, victorious in war, a king who ruled his native land wisely and well. Emer was his son, Hemming's kinsman, Garmund's grandson, a powerful swordsman, and his warrior's shield. Then Beowulf and his men went walking along the shore, down the broad strip of sand. The world's bright candle shone, hurrying up from the south. It was a short journey from their ship to Higlac's home, to the hall where their king, Ongentheow's killer, lived with his warriors and gave treasures away. They walked quickly. The young king knew they were back, Beowulf and his handful of brave men, come safely home. He sat now, waiting to see them, to greet his battle comrades when they arrived at his court. They came, and when Beowulf had bowed to his lord, and standing in front of the throne had solemnly spoken loyal words, Hygelac ordered him to sit at his side. He who had survived sailed home victorious next to his kinsman and king. Mead cups were filled, and Hareth's daughter took them through the hall, carried ale to her husband's comrades. Hygelac, unable to stay silent, anxious to know how Beowulf's adventure had gone, began to question him, courteous, but eager to be told everything. "Beloved Beowulf, tell us what your trip to far-off places brought you, your sudden expedition on the salty waves, your search for war in Hareth. Did you end Hrothgar's hopeless misery? Could you help that glorious king? Grendel's savagery lay heavy on my heart, but I was afraid to let you go to him. For a long time I held you here, kept you safe, forced you to make the Danes fight their own battles. God be praised that my eyes have beheld you once more, unharmed." Beowulf spoke, Ecgtheow's brave son. "My lord Hygelac, my meeting with Grendel and the nighttime battle we fought are known to everyone in Denmark, where the monster was once the uncrowned ruler, murdering and eating Hrothgar's people, forever bringing them misery. I ended his reign, avenged his crimes so completely in the crashing darkness that not even the oldest of his evil kind will ever boast, lying in sin and deceit, that the monster beat me. I sought out Hrothgar first, came to him in his hall. When Healfdene's famous son heard that I'd come to challenge Grendel, he gave me a seat of honor alongside his son. His followers were drinking. I joined their feast, sat with that band, as bright and loud-tongued as any I've ever seen. His famous queen went back and forth, hurrying the cup-bearing boys, giving bracelets and rings to her husband's warriors. I heard the oldest soldiers of all calling for ale from Hrothgar's daughter's hands, and Freya was the way they greeted her when she gave them the golden cups. And Hrothgar will give her to Ingeld, gracious Froda's son. She and that ripening soldier will be married, the Danes' great lord and protector has declared, hoping that his quarrel with the Hathobards can be settled by a woman. He's wrong. How many wars have been put to rest in a prince's bed? Few. A bride can bring a little peace, make spears silent for a time, but not long. Ingeld and all his men will be drinking in the hall when the wedding is done, and Freya is his wife. The Danes will be wearing gleaming armor and ring-marked old swords, and the prince and his people will remember those treasures, will remember that their fathers once wore them, fell with those helmets on their heads, those swords in their hands. And seeing their ancestral armor and weapons, Ingeld and his followers will be angry. And one of his soldiers, sitting with ale in his cup and bitterness heavy in his heart, will remember war and death. And while he sits and drinks, his sharp old tongue will begin to tempt some younger warrior, pushing and probing for a new war. That sword, that precious old blade over there, I think you know it, friend. Your father carried it, fought with it the last time he could swing a sword. The Danes killed him, and many more of our men, and stripped the dead bodies. The brave, bold Danes. One of the princess's people here now might be the murderer's son, boasting about his treasures, his ancient armor, which ought to be yours by right. Bitter words will work in a hot-tempered brain, pushing up thoughts of the past, and then, when he can, calling his father's name, the youngster will kill some innocent Dane, a servant, and bloody sword in hand will run from the hall, knowing his way through the woods. But war will begin as he runs, to the sound of broken oaths, and its heat will dry up Ingeld's heart, leave him indifferent to his Danish bride. Hrothgar may think the Hathobards love him, loving Freyau, but the friendship can't last. The vows are worthless. But of Grendel, you need to know more to know everything. I ought to go on. It was early in the evening. Heaven's jewel had slid to its rest, and the jealous monster, planning murder, came seeking us out, stalking us as we guarded Hrothgar's hall. Honshu, sleeping in his armor, was the first Geat he reached. Grendel seized him, tore him apart, swallowed him down, feet and all, as fate had decreed. A glorious young soldier, killed in his prime. Yet Grendel had only begun his bloody work, meant to leave us with his belly and his pouch both full, and Heorot half empty. Then he tested his strength against mine, hand to hand. His pouch hung at his side, a huge bag sewn from a dragon's skin, worked with a devil's skill. It was closed by a marvelous clasp. The monster intended to take me, put me inside, save me for another meal. He was bold and strong, but once I stood on my feet, his strength was useless, and it failed him. The whole tale of how I killed him, repaid him in kind for all the evil he'd done, would take too long. Your people, my prince, were honored in the doing. He escaped, found a few minutes of life, but his hand, his whole right arm, stayed in Heorot. The miserable creature crept away, dropped to the bottom of his lake, half dead as he fell. When the sun had returned, the Danes' great king poured out treasure, repaid me in hammered gold for the bloody battle I'd fought in his name. He ordered a feast. There were songs and the telling of tales. One ancient Dane told of long dead times, and sometimes Hrothgar himself, with the harp in his lap, stroked its silvery strings and told wonderful stories, a brave king reciting unhappy truths about good and evil. And sometimes he wove his stories on the mournful thread of old age, remembering buried strength and the battles it had won. He would weep, the old king, wise with many winters, remembering what he'd done once, what he'd seen, what he knew. And so we sat the day away feasting. Then darkness fell again, and Grendel's mother was waiting, ready for revenge, hating the Danes for her son's death. The monstrous hag succeeded, burst boldly into Heorot, and killed Esher, one of the king's oldest and wisest soldiers. But when the sun shone once more, the death-weary Danes could not build a pyre and burn his beloved body, lay him on the flaming logs, return ashes to dust. She carried away his corpse, brought it to her den deep in the water. Hrothgar had wept for many of his men, but this time his heart melted. This was the worst. He begged me, in your name, half weeping as he spoke, to seek still greater glory deep in the swirling waves, to win still higher fame, and the gifts he would give me. Down in that surging lake I sought and found her, the horrible hag, fierce and wild. We fought, clutching and grasping. The water ran red with blood, and at last, with a mighty sword that had hung on the wall, I cut off her head. I had barely escaped with my life. My death was not written. And the Danes' protector, Healfdene's great son, heaped up treasures and precious jewels to reward me. He lived his life as a good king must. I lost nothing, none of the gifts my strength could have earned me. He opened his store of gems and armor, let me choose as I liked, so I could bring his riches to you, my ruler, and prove his friendship and my love. Your favor still governs my life. I have almost no family, Hygelac, almost no one now but you. Then Beowulf ordered them to bring in the boar-head banner, the towering helmet, the ancient silvery armor, and the gold-carved sword. This war gear was Hrothgar's reward, my gift from his wise old hands. He wanted me to tell you, first, whose treasures these were. Herger had owned them, his older brother, who was king of Denmark, but Herger kept them, would not give them to Hereward, his brave young son, though the boy had proved his loyalty. These are yours. May they serve you well. And after the gleaming armor, 4 horses were led in, 4 bays, swift and all alike. Beowulf had brought his king horses and treasure, as a man must, not weaving nets of malice for his comrades, preparing their death in the dark with secret cunning tricks. Hygelac trusted his nephew, leaned on his strength in war, each of them intent on the other's joy. And Beowulf gave Wealhtheow's gift, her wonderful necklace, to Hygd, Hygelac's queen, and gave her also 3 supple, graceful, saddle-bright horses. She received his presents, then wore that wonderful jewel on her breast. So Ecgtheow's son proved himself, did as a famous soldier must do, if glory is what he seeks, not killing his comrades in drunken rages, his heart not savage, but guarding God's gracious gift, his strength, using it only in war, and then using it bravely. And yet as a boy he was scorned. The Geats considered him worthless. When he sat in their mead hall, and their lord was making men rich, he held no claim on the king's good will. They were sure he was lazy, noble but slow. The world spun round. He was a warrior more famous than any, and all the insults were wiped out. Then Hygelac, protector of his people, brought in his father's, Beowulf's grandfather's, great sword, worked in gold. None of the Geats could boast of a better weapon. He laid it in Beowulf's lap, then gave him 7,000 hides of land, houses and ground and all. Geatland was home for both king and prince. Their fathers had left them buildings and fields, but Hygelac's inheritance stretched further. It was he who was king and was followed. Afterwards, in the time when Hygelac was dead, and Heardred, his son who'd ruled the Geats after his father, had followed him into darkness, killed in battle with the Swedes, who smashed his shield, cut through the soldiers surrounding their king. Then, when Hygd's one son was gone, Beowulf ruled in Geatland, took the throne he'd refused once, and held it long and well. He was old with years and wisdom, 50 winters a king, when a dragon awoke from its darkness and dreams and brought terror to his people. The beast had slept in a huge stone tower with a hidden path beneath. A man stumbled on the entrance, went in, discovered the ancient treasure, the pagan jewels and gold the dragon had been guarding, and dazzled and greedy, stole a gem-studded cup, and fled. But now the dragon hid nothing, neither the theft nor itself. It swept through the darkness, and all Geatland knew its anger. But the thief had not come to steal. He stole and roused the dragon, not from desire, but need. He was someone's slave, had been beaten by his masters, had run from all men's sight, but with no place to hide. Then he found the hidden path and used it. And once inside, seeing the sleeping beast, staring as it yawned and stretched, not wanting to wake it, terror-struck, he turned and ran for his life, taking the jeweled cup. That tower was heaped high with hidden treasure, stored there years before by the last survivor of a noble race. Ancient riches left in the darkness as the end of a dynasty came. Death had taken them one by one, and the warrior who watched over all that remained mourned their fate, expecting soon the same for himself, knowing the gold and jewels he had guarded so long could not bring him pleasure much longer. He brought the precious cups, the armor, and the ancient swords to a stone tower built near the sea, below a cliff, a sealed fortress with no windows, no doors, waves in front of it, rocks behind. Then he spoke. "Take these treasures, earth, now that no one living can enjoy them. They were yours in the beginning. Allow them to return. War and terror have swept away my people, shut their eyes to delight and to living, closed the door to all gladness. No one is left to lift these swords, polish these jeweled cups. No one leads, no one follows. These hammered helmets, worked with gold, will tarnish and crack. The hands that should clean and polish them are still forever. And these mail shirts, worn in battle once, while swords crashed and blades bit into shields and men, will rust away like the warriors who own them. None of these treasures will travel to distant lands, following their lords. The harp's bright song, the hawk crossing through the hall on its swift wings, the stallion tramping in the courtyard, all gone, creatures of every kind and their masters hurled to the grave. And so he spoke, sadly, of those long dead, and lived from day to day, joyless, until at last death touched his heart and took him too. And a stalker in the night, a flaming dragon, found the treasure unguarded. He whom men fear came flying through the darkness, wrapped in fire, seeking caves and stone-split ruins, but finding gold. Then it stayed, buried itself with heathen silver and jewels it could neither use nor ever abandon. So mankind's enemy, the mighty beast, slept in those stone walls for hundreds of years. A runaway slave roused it, stole a jeweled cup, and bought his master's forgiveness, begged for mercy, and was pardoned when his delighted lord took the present he bore, turned it in his hands, and stared at the ancient carvings. The cup brought peace to a slave, pleased his master, but stirred a dragon's anger. It turned, hunting the thief's tracks, and found them, saw where its visitor had come and gone. He'd survived, had come close enough to touch its scaly head, and yet lived, as it lifted its cavernous jaws through the grace of Almighty God and a pair of quiet, quick-moving feet. The dragon followed his steps, anxious to find the man who had robbed it of silver and sleep. It circled around and around the tower, determined to catch him, but could not. He had run too fast. The wilderness was empty. The beast went back to its treasure, planning a bloody revenge, and found what was missing, saw what thieving hands had stolen. Then it crouched on the stones, counting off the hours till the Almighty's candle went out and evening came. And wild with anger, it could fly, burning across the land, killing and destroying with its breath. Then the sun was gone, and its heart was glad. Glowing with rage, it left the tower, impatient to repay its enemies. The people suffered, everyone lived in terror, but when Beowulf had learned of their trouble, his fate was worse, and came quickly. Vomiting fire and smoke, the dragon burned down their homes. They watched in horror as the flames rose up. The angry monster meant to leave nothing alive, and the signs of its anger flickered and glowed in the darkness, visible for miles. Tokens of its hate and its cruelty, spread like a warning to the Geats who had broken its rest. Then it hurried back to its tower, to its hidden treasure, before dawn could come. It had wrapped its flames around the Geats. Now it trusted in stone walls and its strength to protect it. But they would not. Then they came to Beowulf, their king, and announced that his hall, his throne, the best of buildings, had melted away in the dragon's burning breath. Their words brought misery. Beowulf's sorrow beat at his heart. He accused himself of breaking God's law, of bringing the Almighty's anger down on his people. Reproach pounded in his breast, gloomy and dark, and the world seemed a different place. But the hall was gone. The dragon's molten breath had licked across it, burned it to ashes, near the shore it had guarded. The Geats deserve revenge. Beowulf, their leader and lord, began to plan it. Ordered a battle shield shaped of iron, knowing that wood would be useless, that no linden shield could help him, protect him in the flaming heat of the beast's breath. That noble prince would end his days on earth soon, would leave this brief life, but would take the dragon with him, tear it from the heaped-up treasure it had guarded so long. And he'd go it alone, scorning to lead soldiers against such an enemy. He saw nothing to fear, thought nothing of the beast's claws or wings or flaming jaws. He had fought before against worse odds, had survived, been victorious in harsher battles, beginning in Herat, Hrothgar's unlucky hall. He'd killed Grendel and his mother, swept that murdering tribe away. And he'd fought in Higlac's war against the Frisians, fought at his lord's side till a sword reached out and drank Higlac's blood, till a blade swung in the rush of battle killed the Geats' great king. Then Beowulf escaped, broke through Frisian shields, and swam to freedom, saving 30 sets of armor, from the scavenging Franks, river people who robbed the dead as they floated by. Beowulf offered them only his sword, ended so many jackal lives that the few who were able skulked silently home, glad to leave him. So Beowulf swam sadly back to Geatland, almost the only survivor of a foolish war. Hygelac's widow brought him the crown, offered him the kingdom, not trusting Heardred, her son and Hygelac's, to beat off foreign invaders. But Beowulf refused to rule when his lord's own son was alive, and the leaderless Geats could choose a rightful king. He gave Heardred all his support, offering an open heart where Hygelac's young son could see wisdom he still lacked himself. Warmth and goodwill were what Beowulf brought his new king. But Swedish exiles came, seeking protection. They were rebels against Onela, Halfdane's son-in-law and the best ring-giver his people had ever known. And Onela came too, a mighty king, marched on Geatland with a huge army. Heardred had given his word, and now he gave his life, shielding the Swedish strangers. Onela wanted nothing more. When Heardred had fallen, that famous warrior went back to Sweden. Let Beowulf rule. But Beowulf remembered how his king had been killed. As soon as he could, he lent the last of the Swedish rebels soldiers and gold, helped him to a bitter battle across the wide sea, where victory and revenge and the Swedish throne were won, and Onela was slain. So Ecgtheow's son survived, no matter what dangers he met, what battles he fought, brave and forever triumphant, till the day fate sent him to the dragon and sent him death. A dozen warriors walked with their angry king when he was brought to the beast. Beowulf knew by then what had woken the monster, and enraged it. The cup had come to him, traveled from dragon to slave to master to king, and the slave was their guide, had begun the Geats' affliction, and now, afraid of both beast and men, was forced to lead them to the monster's hidden home. He showed them the huge stones set deep in the ground, with the sea beating on the rocks close by. Beowulf stared, listening to stories of the gold and riches heaped inside. Hidden, but wakeful now, the dragon waited, ready to greet him. Gold and hammered armor had been buried in pleasanter places. The battle-brave king rested on the shore while his soldiers wished him well, urged him on. But Beowulf's heart was heavy. His soul sensed how close fate had come, felt something, not fear, but knowledge of old age. His armor was strong, but his arm hung like his heart. Body and soul might part here. His blood might be spilled, his spirit torn from his flesh. Then he spoke. My early days were full of war, and I survived it all. I can remember everything. I was 7 years old when Hrethel opened his home and his heart for me, when my king and lord took me from my father and kept me, taught me, gave me gold and pleasure, glad that I sat at his knee. And he never loved me less than any of his sons, Herbald the oldest of all, or Halfkine, or Hygelac my lord. Herbald died a horrible death, killed while hunting. Halfkine, his brother, stretched his horn-tipped bow, sent an arrow flying, but missed his mark and hit Herbald instead, found him with a bloody point, and pierced him through. The crime was great, the guilt was plain, but nothing could be done, no vengeance, no death to repay that death, no punishment, nothing. So with the greybeard whose son sins against the king and is hanged. He stands watching his child swing on the gallows, lamenting, helpless, while his flesh and blood hangs for the raven to pluck. He can raise his voice in sorrow, but revenge is impossible. And every morning he remembers how his son died, and despairs. No son to come matters, no future heir, to a father forced to live through such misery. The place where his son once dwelled, before death compelled him to journey away, is a windy wasteland, empty, cheerless. The childless father shudders, seeing it. So riders and ridden sleep in the ground, pleasure is gone, the harp is silent, and hope is forgotten. And then, crying his sorrow, he crawls to his bed. The world and his home hurt him with their emptiness. And so it seemed to Hrethel when Haribald was dead, and his heart swelled with grief. The murderer lived. He felt no love for him now, but nothing could help. Word nor hand, nor sharp-honed blade, war nor hate, battle or blood or law. The pain could find no relief. He could only live with it, or leave grief and life together. When he'd gone to his grave, Hathkine and Higelac, his sons, inherited everything. And then there was war between Geats and Swedes, bitter battles carried across the broad sea, when the mighty Hrethel slept, and Ongentheo's sons thought Sweden could safely attack, saw no use to pretending friendship, but raided and burned, and near old Rensburg slaughtered Geats with their thieving swords. My people repaid them, death for death, battle for battle, though one of the brothers bought that revenge with his life. Hathkine, king of the Geats, killed by a Swedish sword. But when dawn came, the slayer was slain, and Higelac's soldiers avenged everything with the edge of their blades. Efor caught the Swedish king, cracked his helmet, split his skull, dropped him, pale and bleeding, to the ground, then put him to death with a swift stroke, shouting his joy. The gifts that Higelac gave me, and the land I earned with my sword, as fate allowed. He never needed Danes or Goths or Swedes, soldiers and allies bought with gold, bribed to his side. My sword was better and always his. In every battle my place was in front, alone, and so it shall be forever, as long as this sword lasts, serves me in the future as it has served me before. So I killed Dagraf, the Frank who brought death to Higelac, and who looted his corpse. Higid's necklace, Wealhtheow's treasure, never came to Dagraf's king. The thief fell in battle, but not on my blade. He was brave and strong, but I swept him in my arms, ground him against me till his bones broke, till his blood burst out. And now I shall fight for this treasure, fight with both hand and sword.
And Beowulf uttered his final boast. I've never known fear. As a youth, I fought in endless battles. I'm old now, but I'll fight again. Seek fame still, if the dragon, hiding in his tower, dares to face me. And he said farewell to his followers, each in his turn for the last time. I'd use no sword, no weapon, if this beast could be killed without it, crushed to death like Grendel, gripped in my hands and torn limb from limb. But his breath will be burning hot, poison will pour from his tongue. I feel no shame with shield and sword and armor against this monster. When he comes to me, I mean to stand, not run from his shooting flames. Stand till fate decides which of us wins. My heart is firm, my hands calm. I need no hot words. Wait for me close by, my friends. We shall see soon who will survive this bloody battle, stand when the fighting is done. No one else could do what I mean to here. No man but me could hope to defeat this monster. No one could try. And this dragon's treasure, his gold and everything hidden in that tower, will be mine, or war will sweep me to a bitter death. Then Beowulf rose, still brave, still strong, and with his shield at his side and a mail shirt on his breast, strode calmly, confidently, toward the tower, under the rocky cliffs. No coward could have walked there. And then he who had endured dozens of desperate battles, who'd stood boldly while swords and shields clashed, the best of kings, saw huge stone arches and felt the heat of the dragon's breath flooding down through the hidden entrance, too hot for anyone to stand, a streaming current of fire and smoke that blocked all passage. And the Geats' lord and leader, angry, lowered his sword and roared out a battle cry, a call so loud and clear that it reached through the hoary rock, hung in the dragon's ear. The beast rose angry, knowing a man had come, and then nothing but war could have followed. Its breath came first, a steaming cloud pouring from the stone. Then the earth itself shook. Beowulf swung his shield into place, held it in front of him facing the entrance. The dragon coiled and uncoiled its heart, urging it into battle. Beowulf's ancient sword was waiting, unsheathed, his sharp and gleaming blade. The beast came closer. Both of them were ready, each set on slaughter. The Geats' great prince stood firm, unmoving, prepared behind his high shield, waiting in his shining armor. The monster came quickly toward him, pouring out fire and smoke, hurrying to its fate. Flames beat at the iron shield, and for a time it held, protected Beowulf as he'd planned. Then it began to melt, and for the first time in his life that famous prince fought with fate against him, with glory denied him. He knew it, but he raised his sword and struck at the dragon's scaly hide. The ancient blade broke, bit into the monster's skin, drew blood, but cracked and failed him before it went deep enough, helped him less than he needed. The dragon leapt with pain, thrashed and beat at him, spouting murderous flames, spreading them everywhere. And the Geats' ring-giver did not boast of glorious victories in other wars. His weapon had failed him, deserted him now when he needed it most. That excellent sword. Edgethow's famous son stared at death, unwilling to leave this world, to exchange it for a dwelling in some distant place, a journey into darkness that all men must make as death ends their few brief hours on earth. Quickly the dragon came at him, encouraged as Beowulf fell back. Its breath flared, and he suffered, wrapped around in swirling flames, a king before, but now a beaten warrior. None of his comrades came to him, helped him, his brave and noble followers. They ran for their lives, fled deep in a wood, and only one of them remained, stood there miserable, remembering as a good man must what kinship should mean. His name was Wiglaf. He was Wexton's son and a good soldier. His family had been Swedish once. Watching Beowulf, he could see how his king was suffering, burning, remembering everything his lord and cousin had given him, armor and gold and the great estates Wexton's family enjoyed. Wiglaf's mind was made up. He raised his yellow shield and drew his sword, an ancient weapon that had once belonged to Unella's nephew, and that Wexton had won, killing the prince when he fled from Sweden, sought safety with Herdred, and found death. And Wiglaf's father had carried the dead man's armor and his sword to Unella, and the king had said nothing, only given him armor and sword and all, everything his rebel nephew had owned and lost when he left this life. And Wexton had kept those shining gifts, held them for years, waiting for his son to use them, wear them as honorably and well as once his father had done. Then Wexton died, and Wiglaf was his heir, inherited treasures and weapons and land. He'd never worn that armor, fought with that sword, until Beowulf called him to his side, led him into war. But his soul did not melt. His sword was strong. The dragon discovered his courage and his weapon when the rush of battle brought them together. And Wiglaf, his heart heavy, uttered the kind of words his comrades deserved. I remember how we sat in the mead hall, drinking and boasting of how brave we'd be when Beowulf needed us, he who gave us these swords and armor. All of us swore to repay him when the time came, kindness for kindness, with our lives if he needed them. He allowed us to join him, chose us from all his great army, thinking our boasting words had some weight, believing our promises, trusting our swords. He took us for soldiers, for men. He meant to kill this monster himself, our mighty king, fight this battle alone and unaided, as in the days when his strength and daring dazzled men's eyes. But those days are over and gone, and now our Lord must lean on younger arms, and we must go to him while angry flames burn at his flesh. Help our glorious king. By Almighty God, I'd rather burn myself than see flames swirling around my Lord. And who are we to carry home our shields before we've slain his enemy and ours, to run back to our homes with Beowulf so hard-pressed here? I swear that nothing he ever did deserved an end like this, dying miserably and alone, butchered by this savage beast. We swore that these swords and armor were each for us all. Then he ran to his king, crying encouragement as he drove through the dragon's deadly fumes.
Beloved Beowulf, remember how you boasted once that nothing in the world would ever destroy your fame. Fight to keep it now. "Be strong and brave, my noble king, protecting life and fame together. My sword will fight at your side." The dragon heard him, the man-hating monster, and was angry. Shining with surging flames, it came for him, anxious to return his visit. Waves of fire swept at his shield, and the edge began to burn. His mail shirt could not help him, but before his hands dropped the blazing wood, Wiglaf jumped behind Beowulf's shield. His own was burned to ashes. Then the famous old hero, remembering days of glory, lifted what was left of Nagling, his ancient sword, and swung it with all his strength, smashed the grey blade into the beast's head. But then Nagling broke to pieces, as iron always had in Beowulf's hands. His arms were too strong, the hardest blade could not help him, the most wonderfully worked. He carried them to war, but fate had decreed that the Geats' great king would be no better for any weapon. Then the monster charged again, vomiting fire, wild with pain, rushed out fierce and dreadful, its fear forgotten. Watching for its chance, it drove its tusks into Beowulf's neck. He staggered, the blood came flooding forth, fell like rain. And then, when Beowulf needed him most, Wiglaf showed his courage, his strength and skill, and the boldness he was born with. Ignoring the dragon's head, he helped his lord by striking lower down. The sword sank in. His hand was burned, but the shining blade had done its work. The dragon's belching flames began to flicker and die away. And Beowulf drew his battle-sharp dagger. The blood-stained old king still knew what he was doing. Quickly he cut the beast in half, slit it apart. It fell. Their courage had killed it. Two noble cousins had joined in the dragon's death. Yet what they did, all men must do when the time comes. But the triumph was the last Beowulf would ever earn, the end of greatness and life together. The wound in his neck began to swell and grow. He could feel something stirring, burning in his veins, a stinging venom, and knew the beast's fangs had left it. He fumbled along the wall, found a slab of stone, and dropped down. Above him he saw huge stone arches and heavy posts holding up the roof of that giant hall. Then Wiglaf's gentle hands bathed the blood-stained prince, his glorious lord, weary of war, and loosened his helmet. Beowulf spoke, in spite of the swollen, livid wound, knowing he'd unwound his string of days on earth, seen as much as God would grant him. All worldly pleasure was gone, as life would go, soon. I'd leave my armor to my son, now, if God had given me an heir, a child born of my body, his life created from mine. I've worn this crown for 50 winters. No neighboring people have tried to threaten the Geats, sent soldiers against us, or talked of terror. My days have gone by as fate willed, waiting for its word to be spoken, ruling as well as I knew how, swearing no unholy oaths, seeking no lying wars. I can leave this life happy. I can die here, knowing the Lord of all life has never watched me wash my sword in blood born of my own family. Beloved Wiglaf, go, quickly, find the dragon's treasure. We've taken its life, but its gold is ours too. Hurry, bring me ancient silver, precious jewels, shining armor, and gems before I die. Death will be softer, leaving life and this people I've ruled so long, if I look at this last of all prizes. Then Wexton's son went in, as quickly as he could, did as the dying Beowulf asked, entered the inner darkness of the tower, went with his mail shirt and his sword. Flushed with victory, he groped his way, a brave young warrior, and suddenly saw piles of gleaming gold, precious gems scattered on the floor, cups and bracelets, rusty old helmets, beautifully made but rotting, with no hands to rub and polish them. They lay where the dragon left them. It had flown in the darkness once before fighting its final battle. So gold can easily triumph, defeat the strongest of men, no matter how deep it is hidden. And he saw, hanging high above, a golden banner, woven by the best of weavers, and beautiful. And over everything he saw a strange light, shining everywhere, on walls and floor and treasure. Nothing moved, no other monsters appeared. He took what he wanted, all the treasures that pleased his eye, heavy plates and golden cups, and the glorious banner, loaded his arms with all they could hold. Beowulf's dagger, his iron blade, had finished the fire-spitting terror that once protected tower and treasures alike. The gray-bearded lord of the Geats had ended those flying, burning raids forever. Then Wiglaf went back, anxious to return while Beowulf was alive, to bring him treasure they'd won together. He ran, hoping his wounded king, weak and dying, had not left the world too soon. Then he brought their treasure to Beowulf, and found his famous king bloody, gasping for breath. But Wiglaf sprinkled water over his lord, until the words deep in his breast broke through and were heard. Beholding the treasure, he spoke, haltingly, "For this gold, these jewels, I thank our Father in heaven, ruler of the earth. For all of this, that his grace has given me, allowed me to bring to my people while breath still came to my lips. I sold my life for this treasure, and I sold it well. Take what I leave, Wiglaf. Lead my people, help them, my time is gone. Have the brave Geats build me a tomb, when the funeral flames have burned me, and build it here at the water's edge, high on this spit of land, so sailors can see this tower and remember my name, and call it Beowulf's Tower, and boats in the darkness and mist crossing the sea will know it." Then that brave king gave the golden necklace from around his throat to Wiglaf, gave him his gold-covered helmet and his rings and his mail shirt, and ordered him to use them well. "You're the last of all our far-flung family. Fate has swept our race away, taken warriors in their strength, and led them to the death that was waiting. And now I follow them." The old man's mouth was silent, spoke no more, had said as much as it could. He would sleep in the fire soon. His soul left his flesh, flew to glory. And then Wiglaf was left, a young warrior sadly watching his beloved king, seeing him stretched on the ground, left guarding a torn and bloody corpse. But Beowulf's killer was dead too, the coiled dragon cut in half, cold and motionless. Men and their swords had swept it from the earth, left it lying in front of the tower, won its treasure when it fell, crashing to the ground, cut it apart with their hammered blades, driven them deep in its belly. It would never fly through the night, glowing in the dark sky, glorying in its riches, burning and raiding. 2 warriors had shown it their strength, slain it with their swords. Not many men, no matter how strong, no matter how daring, how bold, had done as well, rushing at its venomous fangs, or even quietly entering its tower, intending to steal, but finding the treasure's guardian awake, watching and ready to greet them. Beowulf had gotten its gold, bought it with blood. Dragon and king had ended each other's days on earth. And when the battle was over, Beowulf's followers came out of the wood, cowards and traitors, knowing the dragon was dead. Afraid while it spit its fires to fight in their lord's defense, to throw their javelins and spears, they came like shame-faced jackals, their shields in their hands, to the place where the prince lay dead, and waited for Wiglaf to speak. He was sitting near Beowulf's body, wearily sprinkling water in the dead man's face, trying to stir him. He could not. No one could have kept life in their lord's body, or turned aside the Lord's will. World and men and all move as he orders, and always have and always will. Then Wiglaf turned and angrily told them what men without courage must hear. Wexton's brave son stared at the traitors, his heart sorrowful, and said what he had to. "I say what anyone who speaks the truth must say. Your lord gave you gifts, Swords and armor you stand in now. You sat on the mead hall benches, prince and followers, and he gave you, with open hands, helmets and mail shirts, hunted across the world for the best of weapons. War came, and you ran like cowards, dropped your swords as soon as the danger was real. Should Beowulf have boasted of your help, rejoiced in your loyal strength? With God's good grace, he helped himself, swung his sword alone, won his own revenge. The help I gave him was nothing, but all I was able to give. I went to him, knowing that nothing but Beowulf's strength could save us, and my sword was lucky, found some vital place, and bled the burning flames away. Too few of his warriors remembered to come when our Lord faced death alone. And now the giving of swords, of golden rings, and rich estates is over. Ended for you and everyone who shares your blood. When the brave Geats hear how you bolted and ran, none of your race will have anything left but their lives. And death would be better for them all, and for you, than the kind of life you can lead, branded with disgrace. Then Wiglaf ordered a messenger to ride across the cliff to the Geats who'd waited the morning away, sadly wondering if their beloved king would return or be killed, a troop of soldiers sitting in silence and hoping for the best. Whipping his horse, the herald came to them. They crowded around, and he told them everything, present and past. Our Lord is dead, leader of this people. The dragon killed him, but the beast is dead too, cut in half by a dagger. Beowulf's enemy sleeps in its blood. No sword could pierce its skin, wound that monster. Wiglaf is sitting in mourning, close to Beowulf's body, Wexton's weary son, silent and sad, keeping watch for our king, there where Beowulf and the beast that killed him lie dead. And this people can expect fighting once the Franks and the Frisians have heard that our king lies dead. The news will spread quickly. Hygelac began our bitter quarrel with the Franks, raiding along their river Rhine with ships and soldiers, until they attacked him with a huge army, and Hygelac was killed, the king and many of our men, mailed warriors defeated in war, beaten by numbers. He brought no treasure to the mead hall after that battle. And ever after we knew no friendship with the Franks. Nor can we expect peace from the Swedes. Everyone knows how their old king, Ongentheow, killed Hathkine, caught him near a wood when our young lord went to war too soon, dared too much. The wise old Swede, always terrible in war, allowed the Geats to land and begin to loot, then broke them with a lightning attack, taking back treasures and his kidnapped queen, and taking our king's life. And then he followed his beaten enemies, drove them in front of Swedish swords until darkness dropped, and weary, lordless, they could hide in the wood. But he waited. Ongentheow, with his mass of soldiers, circled around the Geats who'd survived, who'd escaped him, calling threats and boasts at that wretched band the whole night through. In the morning he'd hang a few, he promised, to amuse the birds, then slaughter the rest. But the sun rose to the sound of Hygelac's horns and trumpets, light and that battle cry coming together and turning sad-hearted Geats into soldiers. Hygelac had followed his people and found them. Then blood was everywhere, 2 bands of Geats falling on the Swedes, men fighting on all sides, butchering each other. Sadly, Ongentheow ordered his soldiers back to the high ground where he'd built a fortress. He'd heard of Hygelac, knew his boldness and strength. Out in the open he could never resist such a soldier, defend hard-won treasure, Swedish wives and children, against the Geats' new king. Brave but wise, he fled, sought safety behind earthen walls. Eagerly the Geats followed, sweeping across the field, smashing through the walls, waving Hygelac's banners as they came. Then the gray-haired old king was brought to bay, bright sword blades forcing the lord of the Swedes to take judgment at Eefor's hands. Eefor's brother, Wolf, raised his weapon first, swung it angrily at the fierce old king, cracked his helmet. Blood seeped through his hair. But the brave old Swede felt no fear. He quickly returned a better blow than he'd gotten, faced toward Wulf, then struck him savagely. And Afor's bold brother was staggered, half raised his sword, but only dropped it to the ground. Ongentheow's blade had cut through his helmet, his head spouted blood, and slowly he fell. The wound was deep, but death was not due so soon. Fate let him recover, live on. But Afor, his brave brother, seeing Wulf fall, came forward with his broad-bladed sword, hammered by giants, and swung it so hard that Ongentheow's shield shattered and he sank to the earth, his life ended. Then, with the battlefield theirs, the Geats rushed to Wulf's side, raised him up, and bound his wound. Wulf's brothers stripped the old Swede, took his iron mail shirt, his hilted sword, and his helmet, and all his ancient war. The king welcomed him, warmly thanked him for his gifts, and promised, there where everyone could hear, that as soon as he sat in his mead hall again, Afor and Wulf would have treasure heaped in their battle-hard hands. He'd repay them their bravery with wealth, give them gold and lands and silver rings, rich rewards for the glorious deeds they'd done with their swords. The Geats agreed, and to prove Afor's grace in his eyes, Hygelac swore he'd give him his only daughter. These are the quarrels, the hatreds, the feuds that will bring us battles, force us into war with the Swedes as soon as they've learned how our Lord is dead. Know that the Geats are leaderless, have lost the best of kings. Beowulf, he who held our enemies away, kept land and treasure intact, who saved Hrothgar and the Danes, he who lived all his long life bravely. Then let us go to him, hurry to our glorious Lord, behold him lifeless, and quickly carry him to the flames. The fire must melt more than his bones, more than his share of treasure. Give it all of this golden pile, this terrible, uncounted heap of cups and rings brought with his blood. Burn it to ashes, to nothingness. No one living should enjoy these jewels. No beautiful women wear them, gleaming and golden from their necks, but walk instead, sad and alone, in 100 foreign lands, their laughter gone forever, as Beowulf's has gone, his pleasure and his joy. Spears shall be lifted, many cold mornings lifted and thrown, and warriors shall waken to no harp's bright call, but the croak of the dark black raven, ready to welcome the dead, anxious to tell the eagle how he stuffed his craw with corpses, filled his belly even faster than the wolves. And so the messenger spoke, a brave man on an ugly errand, telling only the truth. Then the warriors rose, walked slowly down the cliff, stared at those wonderful sights, stood weeping as they saw Beowulf dead on the sand, their bold ring-giver resting in his last bed. He'd reached the end of his days, their mighty war-king, the great lord of the Geats, gone to a glorious death. But they saw the dragon first, stretched in front of its tower, a strange scaly beast, gleaming a dozen colors, dulled and scorched in its own heat. From end to end 50 feet, it had flown in the silent darkness, a swift traveler tasting the air, then gliding down to its den. Death held it in his hands. It would guard no caves, no towers, keep no treasures like the cups, the precious plates, spread where it lay, silver and brass, encrusted and rotting, eaten away as though it buried in the earth for 1,000 winters. And all this ancient hoard, huge and golden, was wound around with a spell. No man could enter the tower, open hidden doors, unless the Lord of Victories, he who watches over men, Almighty God himself, was moved to let him enter, and him alone. Hiding that treasure deep in its tower, as the dragon had done, broke God's law and brought it no good. Guarding its stolen wealth, it killed Wiglaf's king, but was punished with death. Who knows when princes and their soldiers, the bravest and strongest of men, are destined to die, their time ended, their homes, their halls empty and still. So Beowulf sought out the dragon, dared it into battle, but could never know what God had decreed, or that death would come to him, or why. So the spell was solemnly laid by men long dead. It was meant to last till the day of judgment. Whoever stole their jewels, their gold, would be cursed with the flames of hell, heaped high with sin and guilt, if greed was what brought him. God alone could break their magic, open his grace to man. Then Wiglaf spoke, Wexton's son. How often an entire country suffers on one man's account. That time has come to us. We tried to counsel our beloved king, our shield and protection, show him danger, urge him to leave the dragon in the dark tower it had lain in so long, live there till the end of the world. Fate and his will were too strong. Everyone knows the treasure his life bought, but Beowulf was worth more than this gold, and the gift is a harsh one. I've seen it all, been in the tower where the jewels and armor were hidden, allowed to behold them once war and its terror were done. I gathered them up, gold and silver, filled my arms as full as I could, and quickly carried them back to my king. He lay right here, still alive, still sure in mind and tongue. He spoke sadly, said I should greet you, asked that after you'd burned his body, you bring his ashes here, make the tallest of towers and his tomb as great and lasting as his fame, when Beowulf himself walked the earth, and no man living could match him. Come, let us enter the tower, see the dragon's marvelous treasure one last time. I'll lead the way, take you close to that heap of curious jewels and rings and gold. Let the pyre be ready and high. As soon as we've seen the dragon's hoard, we will carry our beloved king, our leader and lord, where he'll lie forever in God's keeping. Then Wiglaf commanded the wealthiest Geats, brave warriors and owners of land, leaders of his people, to bring wood for Beowulf's funeral. Now the fire must feed on his body, flames grow heavy and black with him who endured arrows falling in iron showers, feathered shafts, barbed and sharp, shot through linden shields, storms of eager arrowheads dropping. And Wexton's wise son took 7 of the noblest Geats, led them together down the tunnel, deep into the dragon's tower. The one in front had a torch, held it high in his hands. The best of Beowulf's followers entered behind that gleaming flame, seeing gold and silver rotting on the ground, with no one to guard it. The Geats were not troubled with scruples or fears, but quickly gathered up treasure and carried it out of the tower. And they rolled the dragon down to the cliff and dropped it over. Let the ocean take it, the tides sweep it away. Then silver and gold and precious jewels were put on a wagon with Beowulf's body and brought down the jutting sand where the pyre waited. A huge heap of wood was ready, hung around with helmets and battle shields and shining mail shirts, all as Beowulf had asked. The bearers brought their beloved lord, their glorious king, and weeping laid him high on the wood. Then the warriors began to kindle that greatest of funeral fires. Smoke rose above the flames, black and thick, and while the wind blew and the fire roared, they wept, and Beowulf's body crumbled and was gone. The Geats stayed, moaning their sorrow, lamenting their lord. A gnarled old woman, hair wound tight and gray on her head, groaned a song of misery, of infinite sadness and days of mourning, of fear and sorrow to come, slaughter and terror and captivity. And heaven swallowed that billowing smoke. Then the Geats built the tower as Beowulf had asked, strong and tall, so sailors could find it from far and wide. Working for 10 long days, they made his monument, sealed his ashes in the walls, as straight and high as wise and willing hands could raise them. And the riches he and Wiglaf had won from the dragon, rings, necklaces, ancient hammered armor, all the treasures they'd taken were left there too. Silver and jewels buried in the sandy ground, back in the earth again and forever hidden and useless to men. And then 12 of the bravest Geats rode their horses around the tower, telling their sorrow, telling stories of their dead king and his greatness, his glory, praising him for heroic deeds, for a life as noble as his name. So should all men raise up words for their lords, warm with love when their shield and protector leaves his body behind, sends his soul on high. And so Beowulf's followers rode, mourning their beloved leader, crying that no better king had ever lived, no prince so mild, no man so open to his people, so deserving of praise.